Here is what nobody tells you about war. It doesn't end at the ceasefire. It doesn't end at the treaty table, or the handshake, or the flag folded into a triangle and handed to someone's mother on a Tuesday afternoon while a bugler plays something that makes grown men's chins tremble. It doesn't end when the guns go quiet or when the last boot print dries in the mud. War ends, if it ends, in the dark. Alone, in the space between one breath and the next, when a man has nothing left to hold onto except the smallest, most embarrassing things. The smell of his wife's shampoo. The way his kid mispronounces spaghetti. The specific creak of the third step on the stairs back home that he always meant to fix and now would give his remaining good hand just to hear again. That's where this story lives. Not on a map. Not in the after-action report that crossed my desk with its clean, clinical language. Engagement conducted. Objective unresolved. One survivor extracted at 0547 hours. One survivor. As if that's a data point. As if that's a sentence you read and then move on. I didn't move on. I've been doing this job for 11 years. I process reports. I cross-reference coordinates. I am, to be frank, extraordinarily good at staying at a professional distance from a material, which is a polite way of saying I've trained myself not to think about the fact that the material is people. And then I read the report about Firebase Kestrel. And then I requested the interview. And then Sergeant First Class Dominic Reyes walked into my office, sat down, folded his hands on his knees like a man who decided to be very still on purpose, and looked at me with eyes that had clearly stopped sleeping sometime around last November and hadn't started again. I asked him what happened out there. He said, "Which part do you want?" I said, "All of it." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I noticed a small scar on his left jawline that the intake medical photos hadn't caught. Long enough that I started to think he was going to stand up and leave without saying another word, which honestly I would have understood. Then he said, "Martinez started it. He had this theory about the ghost." And I opened my notebook, and I stopped being a professional. Part 1. The theory of the ghost told from the field notes and recorded testimony of Lieutenant Colonel Priya Anand, ISR Division, compiled 72 hours post-extraction. I have a habit I'm not proud of. When someone starts talking, really talking, the way Reyes talked that morning, with his hands still and his voice coming from somewhere below his sternum, I draw small spirals in the corner of my notepad. Not doodles, not art, just spirals getting smaller and smaller toward a center that never quite arrives. My graduate advisor once told me it meant I was a person who needed to find the point. I told him that was a generous interpretation. Reyes didn't look at my notepad. He looked at the middle distance, at the wall behind my left shoulder, specifically at a point roughly 18 inches above the acoustic tile, and he talked. Not continuously. He talked the way a man reconstructs a building from rubble, one piece at a time, checking each one before he puts it down, deciding whether it bears weight. The ghost, he told me, had been operating in the Kestrel sector for approximately 14 weeks before the night in question. It wasn't a person, or it wasn't confirmed to be a person. That distinction matters, and I want to be precise about it because the distinction was doing a great deal of psychological work for the 8 soldiers who spent that night in the hills above the Darwin corridor. The ghost was a pattern, a thermal signature that appeared on surveillance at irregular intervals, always between 2200 and 0300, always moving in the broken terrain northeast of the firebase. Always, and this is the part that had made 3 separate analysts flag the footage for review, moving in a way that suggested it knew where the sensors were. Not approximately, not by chance. Knew. It went around them. It went under the sight lines, through the 140-meter gap in the perimeter coverage that only existed because of a ridge formation that wasn't fully represented in the topographic data uploaded to the basis system. Somebody, the analyst concluded, had either done extraordinary recon or had access to the system architecture itself. Command called it a surveillance asset. Not like scary ghost, Reyes told me. And for the first time something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one, which I noted and then immediately felt bad about. Like a ghost. Like it wasn't a person at all. Marty had this whole theory. The theory, as reconstructed from Reyes's account and corroborated by the partial audio recovered from Corporal Yun's helmet cam before it lost power at hour 4, went roughly like this. Martinez believed the thermal signature wasn't a person. Martinez believed it was an automated unit, a small drone or ground vehicle remote-operated designed to map sensor placements, and that the real threat, the human threat, had never actually been in those hills at all. The ghost was a decoy, a lure, and the 14 weeks of increasingly aggressive search and clear operations in the northeastern terrain had been, in Martinez's estimation, exactly what someone wanted. "I told him to knock it off," Reyes said. I asked why. He picked at a thread on the knee of his trousers. One slow pull, because he was probably right, and because we were going anyway. I want to stop here and say something about Dominic Reyes because the record won't do it, and the record is what survives. The record shows a 34-year-old man with 11 years of service, 2 tours in 2 different theaters, a commendation for actions during the Haversham Bridge operation that he has never once mentioned in any official or unofficial context, and a psych evaluation 6 months prior that noted. And I'm quoting directly, subject demonstrates high-functioning compartmentalization of operational stress. Recommend continued monitoring. Continued monitoring. As if that's a thing that happens. As if someone is monitoring. What the record doesn't show is the way he sat in my office chair. Like a man who had decided his spine was a structural column, and he was going to hold the building up whether or not the building deserved it. What the record doesn't show is that when he talked about Martinez, when he said the name Alejandro Martinez for the first time, his jaw moved once laterally like he'd bitten down on something and then stopped. I kept drawing spirals. The 8-man element left Firebase Kestrel at 21:30 on a Thursday in November. Weather, overcast, no moon worth speaking of, temperature at the ridge somewhere around 4 degrees Celsius with a wind that Reyes described as the kind that gets into your ears and stays there. Visibility was poor. The terrain between the firebase and the northeastern corridor involved approximately 2 kilometers of broken ground. Rocky, intermittently forested, cut through by a dry stream bed that ran diagonal to their route, and would, as it turned out, matter enormously. The element, Reyes, Martinez, Corporal Jean Yun, Corporal Tasha Brennan, Specialist Orloff, Specialist Theung Park, Private First Class Osei, and Staff Sergeant Hector Lugo, who was the second in command and who Reyes described unprompted as the best land navigator I've ever seen, including people who do it professionally, which he also did professionally. I wrote that down. I'm not sure why. I write down the things that aren't in the report because they're the ones that end up being load-bearing. The plan was a standard sweep in, confirm, 2 teams moving parallel lines through the northeastern corridor, pushing toward the ridge, looking for physical evidence of the ghost presence, equipment caches, tracks, comms relays, anything that confirmed or denied Martinez's drone theory. Rules of engagement were clear. They weren't hunting a person. They were hunting information. That's what the plan was. First hour was fine, Reyes said. Normal. Cold. You made a joke about his girlfriend's cooking that nobody laughed at, but everybody smiled. Lugo was reading the ground like it was a newspaper. Martinez kept checking his watch. I asked about the watch. Old G-Shock. His uncle's. He checked it every 15 minutes or so. I don't know why. Habit. He'd been doing it since his first deployment. I think it was a thing he did when he was concentrating. Like how some people crack their knuckles. The element reached the first waypoint without incident. Reyes's team, himself, Martinez, Yun, and Osei pushed north toward the ridge. Lugo's team held the eastern flank and would sweep west to close the corridor. At 23:14, Orloff's radio made a sound Reyes described as like feedback, but wrong. Not static, not interference. The right-shaped sound in the wrong key. Lugo radioed it as an anomaly. Logged it. Moved on. At 23:41, Park's helmet cam flickered. At 23:58, Osei grabbed Reyes's sleeve, and when Reyes turned, Osei pointed at the ridgeline and didn't say anything at all. The thermal imaging on Reyes's scope showed nothing. The ridge was cold. Empty. 2 degrees of ambient rock. Osei kept pointing. He didn't have a scope, Reyes said. He was pointing at something he saw with his own eyes. In the dark, on a cloudy night with no moon. I looked up from my notepad. What did he see? Reyes was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted, not because I'm a precise person, but because the silence had a texture to it, something that pressed. Movement. Low, lateral, fast. He said it moved like it was deciding something. This is the part of the account where I have to be honest about my own limitations as a recorder of events. I am trained in signals intelligence. I understand pattern analysis. I believe professionally in the rational explanation, in the mundane truth that almost always turns out to underlie the thing that initially looks inexplicable. Sensor anomalies have causes. Thermal ghosts have origins. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine with a documented tendency to find faces in static and intention in randomness. I believe all of that. And I also wrote, moved like it was deciding something in my notepad and put a box around it. Because the next 43 minutes, as Reyes described them, had the quality of something that had been decided somewhere upstream of their arrival. Not a trap, exactly. Not an ambush in any tactical sense Reyes could cleanly articulate. More like, and he paused here, searching for it, like walking into a room where a conversation has been happening about you. At 0017, Lugo's team lost comms. Not all at once. In the specific way that turns your blood cold. One voice, then two, then the carrier's signal dropping out, then nothing. Not jamming. Reyes knew jamming had been jammed before and described it as an immediate, total wall. This was sequential. This was deliberate degradation. I tried Lugo Direct. Nothing. I tried Brennan. Nothing. I tried the Firebase. I got 3 words, maybe 4, and then the same wrong feedback sound. Reyes stopped Park from breaking off to find Lugo's team. I asked if that was a hard call. No, he said, which was the first lie he told me. I recognized it because his jaw did the lateral thing again. He redirected his team north. Not because north made tactical sense in that moment. It didn't. The objective was now functionally compromised, and the rational move was withdrawal. But because the movement Osei had seen was north, and Martinez, who had been quiet for 11 minutes, said it's going to the ridge with the flat certainty of a man reading a schematic. Reyes moved north. I want you to understand what that decision cost before it cost anything else. Lugo's team was east, unreachable. The Firebase was south, compromised communication, 18 minutes away on foot in darkness across broken ground. His 4-man element was a kilometer from the ridge in terrain that was now, demonstrably, containing something that didn't want to be found. He moved north, not because he was reckless, not because he was unafraid. He had a blister on his right heel that had been bleeding for 3 hours, and he hadn't mentioned it to anyone. He had a photograph of his daughter in the left breast pocket of his plate carrier, folded in half, worn soft at the crease from. He told me this like a man confessing something small and true, from taking it out to look at it more often than he'd admit. He moved north because Martinez was right about the ghost, and because if Martinez was right about the ghost, then the thing on that ridge wasn't a drone. It was a person, and a person could be reached. They found the first evidence at 0031. Not equipment, not a cache, not a relay station or a tripwire or any of the things the after-action report's vocabulary had prepared me to expect. A boot print. One. In a small patch of mud at the edge of the dry stream bed that ran diagonal to their route. Martinez went down on one knee next to it with his red lens flashlight, and Reyes watched him study it in silence for what he estimated was 90 seconds, which is a very long time to look at a boot print. He said, "It's small." I waited, and then he said, "It's been here a while." Reyes looked at the wall again, and then he said, "I don't think it's military." The boot print was not a boot print. Not precisely. The pattern was wrong for any military-issue footwear in any database Martinez could cite, and Martinez could cite most of them, had a documented interest in field craft that his evaluations noted as constructive obsession. The tread was partial, the depth consistent with a body weight significantly below anything on the Elements roster. The mud around it was undisturbed on 3 sides. Whatever had made it had come from the west, stepped once, and gone straight up the rocky face of the streambed bank without leaving another mark. Marty looked up at me, Reyes said, and paused. And I knew what he was thinking because I was thinking it too. I asked what they were both thinking. He unfolded his hands on his knees, then folded them again. That the ghost wasn't military. The ridge was another 600 meters. In good conditions, on flat terrain, 600 meters is nothing. A casual walk, an afterthought. In the dark on broken ground, with no comms for degrees of wind, and something moving in the terrain above you that is 14 weeks of practice not being seen, 600 meters is the rest of your life, measured out in boot falls. Osei went first because Osei had the clearest eyes of anyone Reyes had ever served with, and he'd proven twice already that night. Yin covered from the stream bed. Martinez moved parallel to Reyes, slightly left, and Reyes watched him check his uncle's watch at 0038 and then not check it again. When a man stops doing his nervous habit, Reyes told me, it means one of two things. He's calm, or he's past calm. At 0049, Osei stopped. He stopped in a specific way, full body, sudden, not a hesitation, but a ceasing that Reyes had learned over 11 years to treat as information equivalent to a sensor alert. Osei didn't gesture. Osei didn't radio. Osei simply stopped, and in the stillness, Reyes heard it. Breathing. Not his own. Not the wind. 15 meters upslope, in the rocks in the dark, breathing. Quiet. Controlled. The breathing of someone who had been waiting for a long time and was used to it. Reyes gave the signal to hold. For bodies went still. The wind moved over the ridge and carried nothing useful. The breathing continued. And then a voice said, in accented but entirely comprehensible English, with the flat exhaustion of someone who has been cold for much longer than this particular night, I was hoping you would come. I put my pen down. Reyes looked at me for the first time since he'd started talking. Yeah, he said. That was our reaction too. The figure who came down from the rocks was, Reyes paused longer here than anywhere else in the account, in a way that my spiral-drawing brain interpreted as the pause of a man choosing precision over shorthand. A kid. Not a child, but young. 20, maybe 22. Wrapped in something that looked like it had been cut from a thermal blanket and then wore until it stopped being a blanket and became just a shape. Male. Injured. Left arm held at an angle that suggested the shoulder had been out and gone back in at some point recently and without assistance. Hands up immediately before Osei had even finished raising his rifle. Hands up and eyes on Reyes specifically, as if he'd already determined who the decision-maker was. He said, I am not the thing you are looking for. I am the person who has been watching it, and it knows you are here. 3 sentences. In the dark. On a cold ridge in November, from a half-frozen young man with a dislocated shoulder that he'd popped back himself at some point in the recent past, and was clearly not mentioning. Martinez said quietly into the silence, Told you. Yin said, less quietly, Sweet mercy. Reyes said nothing. He was doing math, threat assessment, extraction, comms, Lugo's team still unreachable to the east, time to sunrise at roughly 0547, 5.5 hours. He was doing math and looking at this young man who had hands up and eyes steady and a body that had been alone on a cold ridge long enough to develop the particular stillness of something feral. And Reyes was thinking, he told me this and then told me he didn't usually admit to what he thought in the field because it sounded unprofessional. He was thinking, who did this to you? Not what are you? Not are you a threat? Not what's your objective? Who did this to you? He told me later that wasn't the question I should have been asking, Reyes said. I asked what the right question was. Reyes looked at his hands. The young man's name, as it eventually emerged, was Tariq. Not the name he gave first. The name he gave first was a designation, a number-letter combination that Reyes repeated to me from memory with the particular flatness of a man reciting something he'd turned over enough times that it had stopped feeling like language. A registration, the kind of identifier you get when someone decides you're a category before you were a person. Reyes said, I didn't use it. I asked him his actual name. There was a pause. He looked at me like I'd asked him what color the sky was on a different planet. Tarek, 21 years old, as it turned out, a year off from Reyes's estimate, which Reyes noted with the faint self-correcting precision of a man who keeps his own score. He'd been on the ridge and in the northeastern corridor for 19 days. Not 14 weeks. That was the ghost's total operational window. Tarek had been there for 19 days, which meant he'd arrived 5 weeks into the ghost's activity, which meant he was not the ghost. He was the person watching the ghost. And the ghost, as Tarek explained, in clipped, careful English that had the quality of language learned under pressure, all the grammar present, and all the softness stripped out, was not a drone, was not a surveillance asset, was not, in any clean tactical sense, a military operation at all. It's a man, Tarek said. One man. And he is not coming down. I need to tell you about the shoulder. Not because it's tactically significant, because it's the thing I keep returning to when I review my notes, the detail I've circled 3 times in different colored ink without being fully conscious of doing it. At some point in the 19 days, Tarek had fallen. Not far, 1.5 meters, maybe 2, in the dark on the western face of the ridge. He'd landed wrong. The shoulder had come forward and out of its socket with what he described, in a single phrase, and then never again as a sound like a green branch. He'd been alone. No one to brace against. No medical kit beyond what he'd been carrying, which was not much. He had found a rock, a specific rock, wedged in the crevice at an angle, and he had used the rock and gravity and approximately 6 minutes of what I can only describe from how Reyes reported it to me and from the way Reyes's own hands flexed slightly on his knees as he described it, as breathtaking, deliberate suffering. He'd put his own shoulder back in. Then, he'd wrapped it with strips from the thermal blanket material. Then, he'd rested for 2 hours, which was the maximum he calculated he could afford. Then, he continued his observation. When Reyes noticed the way he was holding the arm and asked about it, this was approximately 4 minutes into their initial encounter, from minutes of rapid situation assessment in the dark while Martinez and Osei kept overwatch. Tarek said, It works. Don't spend time on it. Reyes spent time on it anyway. Not immediately, but he filed it. Reyes was very good at filing things, I was learning. He had a whole internal cabinet of other people's pain that he accessed on a schedule he hadn't consciously developed, but which ran, from what I could piece together, on a cycle of observe, file, return a later when you can afford it. The blister on his heel. The photograph worn soft at the crease. Tarek's shoulder held at its careful angle, the body compensating without discussion. The cabinet was getting full. The ghost, Tarek told them, was a man named Vasil. He said the name the way you say the name of a weather system. Not with fear, not with hatred, with a kind of exhausted accuracy. Vasil, a man of approximately 55, former signals engineer, who had been in the northeastern hill for the full 14 weeks, and who was, in Tarek's assessment, not conducting surveillance. He was destroying it, not the firebase's surveillance. His own. I did not understand at first, Tarek said, and Reyes told me he noted the word first with the same alertness he'd apply to any piece of intelligence that indicated a revision. I watched him for 6 days before I understood. He moves like a man who is taking something apart. He goes to the sensor sites, your sensor sites, the ones that point northeast, and he sits near them. Not close. Near. And he watches them. For hours. Martinez, who had been very still through this entire exchange in the way of a person whose brain is running significantly faster than their body, said quietly, He's mapping the coverage pattern. Tarek looked at him. No, he already knows the coverage pattern. He has known it for weeks. He is not learning it. A pause. He is looking at it. Looking at it, Reyes repeated. Like a man who built something and cannot stop standing in front of it. Reyes told me he had a decision to make at 0103. He laid it out with the clean economy of someone who has rehearsed this part. Not for my benefit, I thought, but for his own, the way you rehearse a thing that you're not sure you'd make the same choice on twice. Option 1. Extract south with Tarek, abandon the ridge objective, attempt to re-establish contact with Lugo's team, accept that the operation was a wash and that Vasil, whoever Vasil was, whatever Vasil was doing, remained unresolved. Option 2. Push to the ridge. Find Vasil. Determine whether he was a threat or a tragedy or both, which in Reyes's experience were not mutually exclusive categories. The rational choice was south. The rational choice was, comms are down, the team is at reduced strength, the situation has changed materially from the operational plan, you have a civilian asset with a damaged shoulder, and none of your training supports continuing toward an unknown contact in degraded conditions. Reyes chose the ridge. He told me this without apology and without the performance of guilt. He told me it factually, the way he told me the temperature and the terrain, and then he told me why. Martinez looked at me, he said, and I thought about what he'd said at the firebase. That the 14 weeks of operations had been exactly what someone wanted. That we'd been running ourselves around these hills, chasing a lure. He stopped, and I thought, what if Vasil isn't the lure? What if Vasil is the point? What if the whole thing, 14 weeks of pattern, 14 weeks of making us look northeast, what if it was just to make sure someone eventually came up that ridge and found him? I put my pen down again. Found him, I said. Or saw him, Reyes said. Not the same thing. It took them 40 minutes to reach the top of the ridge. Tarek moved with them, which Reyes had not asked him to do, and which he had not been able to stop once it became clear that Tarek knew the terrain in the dark in a way none of them did. He moved upslope like a man who has learned a particular piece of ground the way you learn a recurring nightmare. Every step placed with the grim familiarity of someone who has made this walk enough times that their body does it before their mind catches up. Osei stayed close to Tarek without being asked. Not guarding, just close. I noticed when I reviewed the partial helmet cam footage from Yun, the 5 minutes recovered before the power failure, that Osei was walking with his left side slightly toward Tarek, the side away from his rifle hand. An unconscious thing, a making space thing. I keep coming back to that, to the body's knowledge. Martinez was quiet the whole climb. His uncle's G-Shock was in his left hand, not on his wrist. He'd taken it off at some point and was carrying it, which Reyes said he'd never seen him do before, and which registered as the kind of data point that doesn't belong to any category yet. At 0143, they crested the ridge. The wind-up there was something different. Not 4 degrees. Less. And loud. The kind of loud that is actually silence with texture, the ambient roar of elevation and open sky, filling the ears with white noise that makes everything else feel provisional. Vasil was sitting on a rock 40 meters northeast of the ridgeline, facing away from them toward the firebase. He was not hiding. He was not running any equipment. He was not armed, as far as Reyes could determine, though he qualified that with the calm of a man who knew, as far as I could determine, was doing a lot of work in that sentence. He was sitting on a rock in the cold, looking at the firebase 14 kilometers south, and he had been there long enough that frost had formed on the shoulders of his coat. Tarek said something then, in a language Reyes didn't have, and Vasil's head turned. Old. Reyes had estimated 55 and found he'd been wrong in the direction he hadn't expected. 60+, a face that had been compressed by weather, and time is something harder and more specific than age alone could account for. Eyes that registered Reyes, Martinez, Yun, Osei in sequence, without panic, with a measured inventory of a man who has been found before and has decided how he feels about it. He said something back to Tarek. Short. Flat. Tarek translated. He says he knew you would come eventually. He says he is glad you brought enough people. Martinez said, under his breath. Enough people for what? Tarek looked at Martinez with something that might have been, in better light, the beginning of a smile. To carry what he wants to show you. What Vasil wanted to show them was buried. Not buried deep. 1/2 meter in soil that had been disturbed and replaced with enough care that Reyes had walked over the site before Vasil's gesturing made him stop and look down. A metal case, military grade, sealed with a locking mechanism that Vasil opened with a key he wore on a cord around his neck. Inside, a hard drive, documentation, physical, printed, in 2 languages Reyes didn't read, stacked in sealed plastic sleeves, and a communications log, a handwritten record of transmissions, dates, frequencies, contacts going back for years. Not 14 weeks. For years. Reyes looked at the case, and then looked at Vasil and said, simply, "Who are you?" Tarek translated. Vasil answered at length. The translation came in pieces, Tarek working through it with the careful attention of someone who understood that precision mattered, and that being wrong would cost something real. He was an engineer. He built the thing you have been calling a surveillance network. He built the coverage gaps on purpose. He built the sensor architecture of this entire corridor and two others, and he built what looks like protection but was designed from the beginning to be a trap. He built it because he was told to. He wants you to know he built it because he was told to. He has been here for 14 weeks, making sure you would eventually come up this ridge and find what he buried, because he could not carry it out alone, because he is 63 years old with bad knees, and they would have stopped him at any checkpoint, and because he does not trust the system of transmission. Not anymore. He trusts. Tarek paused, finding the word. He trusts a person who climbs a hill. Vasil said something else, shorter. Tarek said, he says he is sorry it took so long. I need to tell you about the 4 hours between 0200 and 0547. I need to tell you because the after-action report does not tell you, and the report is what survives. The comms were down. Lugo's team was east, unreachable. The element was on a ridge with 63-year-old Vasil, who had bad knees and had been sitting in the cold for a while, and who was demonstrably not going to be able to move at any pace that tactical extraction required. Tarek had a damaged shoulder. The case weighed, Reyes estimated, 12 kilograms. Reyes had a decision to make again. Except it wasn't a decision, and he knew it wasn't a decision, and the knowing of it was a different kind of weight. We split the load, he said. Yin took the hard drive. Osei took the documentation. Martinez took the comms log. You took Vasil, I said. Reyes looked at his hands. He couldn't keep pace. We had to get below the ridge before first light, or we'd be visible for about 4 kilometers in any direction. He paused. So yeah, I took Vasil. I asked what that meant, practically. Arm over my shoulder. His pace as fast as we could push it. Every 20 minutes, he needed to stop. Not because he wanted to. He didn't want to. He kept trying to wave me off and keep moving, which respect, but no, because his knees locked up in the cold, and it took a minute for them to remember what they were supposed to do. Every 20 minutes. 14 kilometers. For degrees and falling. Martinez, Reyes said, and the jaw thing happened. Martinez walked with us. He didn't have to. The case was split. He was carrying his portion. There was no tactical reason to stay with the slower element. Reyes looked at the wall. He just stayed. He kept talking to Vasil. Vasil didn't have English, and Martinez had about 12 words of the relevant language, but he talked anyway. About nothing. About the cold. About his uncle's watch, which he was wearing again by then, I noticed. Just kept talking. I asked why. Because, Reyes said, and stopped. Tried again. Because Vasil had been alone up there for 14 weeks, and Martinez understood something about that, and he just didn't want the man to feel alone anymore. Even in the cold. Even in the dark. A pause. Marty was like that. Was. The past tense arrived in the room and sat down. I kept drawing spirals. Smaller. The center not arriving. At 0331, they made contact with Lugo. Not by radio. The radios were still producing the wrong frequency feedback that Reyes had begun in the back of his mind, where he filed things to wonder about. They made contact because Lugo's team, navigating by compass and by Lugo's extraordinary memory for terrain, had moved south toward the firebase and then swung wide east and then north, and had, through a combination of military land navigation and what Lugo would describe in his own subsequent debrief as a hunch that Reyes was doing something stupid, intersected with the element's withdrawal route at a dry stream bed. Lugo saw them come out of the rocks and said, Reyes reported this with what was unmistakably affection, the first clear, unguarded thing I'd heard in 2 hours. I leave you alone for 4 hours, and you found a grandfather. Vasil, who did not understand this, responded to Lugo's tone with a short, dignified sentence that Tarek translated as, "He says he is glad you have a sense of humor. He says this suggests you are probably good at the work." Lugo looked at Tarek, looked at Vasil, looked at the case distributed across 3 soldiers' kit. "Copy that," Lugo said. The last 2 kilometers were the worst. Not because of terrain. The ground flattened south of the stream bed, opened up, gave them pace they hadn't had on the ridge. Not because of weather, which had actually eased slightly, the wind dropping, the temperature settling into the specific cold without bite that is almost bearable. Because at 0412, Orloff, who had been on Lugo's team and had been quiet since the reunion, said quietly into the element net, "Movement. East. 2 no, 3 contacts. 600 meters." And the element, which was carrying a 63-year-old man with bad knees and a 21-year-old with a bad shoulder and 12 kilograms of buried evidence in plastic sleeve documentation, was still 900 meters from Firebase Kestrel's outer perimeter. 900 meters. Reyes did the math. The math said, if you move at the pace you can maintain with Vasil, you're not going to make that perimeter before the eastern contacts close to engagement range. The math said, you have to go faster than you can go. I told Vasil, Reyes said. I told him we needed to move, and I pointed east, and I said people, and held up 3 fingers because it was the clearest thing I could do without Tarek, and he looked east, and he looked at me, and he nodded. And then Reyes stopped. He told Tarek something, and Tarek translated it, and it was a pause. It was the clearest thing anyone said to me that whole night. I waited. He said, I did not carry it this far to drop it. Move. Move. Not I'm ready. Not let's go. Not I'll try. Move. The imperative. The command form. From a 63-year-old man with locked knees on a cold hillside in the dark to a 34-year-old soldier who had been carrying him for 3 hours, directed not at himself, but at Reyes. As if the moving that was required was not Vasil's. As if what Vasil understood, in that moment, was that the person who needed permission to accelerate was not him. They moved. The after-action report records this as element increased pace to maximize distance from eastern contacts, reaching perimeter at 0532. The after-action report does not record Lugo and Brennan each taking one of Vasil's arms and running the last 400 meters in a kind of 3-person stagger that Reyes described as the ugliest thing I've ever been part of and the proudest. The after-action report does not record Tarek, whose shoulder was screaming by this point in a language that didn't require translation, who was carrying documentation in his good arm with his bad arm pressed to his body, who did not once ask to stop. The after-action report does not record Martinez on the far left of the running formation, the comms log under one arm, his uncle's watch catching the first suggestion of pre-dawn light, talking. Still talking. To no one or to all of them, in a steady low voice, about nothing that mattered except that it was sound, and sound meant still here, still moving, still here. The eastern contacts did not close to engagement range. They never found out why. Reyes thought, and thought with the care of a man who doesn't say things he's not prepared to defend, that the contact had not been there for them, that whatever was operating in the northeastern corridor had other business that night, that they had, perhaps, moved through the edge of something rather than the center of it, and the edge had not noticed them, or had noticed them and made its own calculation. He was not certain. He filed it. The perimeter gate opened at 0534. Vasil walked through under his own power. Tarek followed. Reyes was last. Sunrise came at 0547, and it was, Reyes told me, with the practiced understatement of a man who has learned that the things you say plainly hit harder than the things you ornament, the specific color of something you didn't expect to see again. I wrote that down. I drew a spiral next to it that was smaller than any I'd drawn all morning. Vasil's documentation was, as the intelligence assessment would confirm 17 days later, what Reyes had suspected and what the weight of it had implied on the long walk down, significant. Architecturally significant. The kind of significant that changes things upstream of this particular firebase, upstream of this particular corridor, with implications that I am not, in this document, at liberty to specify. What I am at liberty to say is that Vasil was 63 years old and had bad knees and had sat alone on a cold ridge for 14 weeks with buried evidence and a plan that depended entirely on someone eventually climbing the hill. And that his plan had been built on a specific belief, that the person who climbs the hill is the person who can be trusted with what's at the top of it, that the effort of the climb is not incidental to the trust, it is the trust, that you know who someone is by what they will do in the cold, in the dark, over broken ground for someone they don't know. He'd been waiting for a year and a half before the 14 weeks, waiting for the right operation, the right conditions, the right people. I asked Reyes, near the end of our session, if he thought Vasil had known, had specifically chosen, had waited for an element that would make the decision to push north instead of extract south. Reyes was quiet. I think, he said, that he'd been watching long enough to know what kind of people to look for. The same way you can look at a piece of ground and know if it'll hold weight. He paused. Marty would have been able to tell you. He was good at that kind of theory. The past tense again. I'll let it sit. Martinez was wounded at 0521. Not by the eastern contacts, they never engaged. By the perimeter, in the final push, in the specific chaotic dark of 8 people and 2 civilians crossing from uncontrolled to controlled terrain in a hurry. A round from a weapon that should not have been discharged and was from a direction that the investigation would subsequently spend considerable energy on, fired by a member of the firebase's own perimeter guard who had not been adequately briefed on the element's expected extraction route because the comms were down and no one had updated the watch rotation, a round that should not have been fired. Martinez went down at the gate. I'm not going to make this neater than it is because it isn't neat and it was never going to be neat, and the neatening of it would be a violence I'm not willing to commit. He went down at the gate. He went down at 0521 with the comms log under his arm and his uncle's watch on his wrist, 26 meters from the inside of the perimeter, and Reyes was there and Lugo was there, and it was bad. Reyes told me this in 5 sentences. He told me the next part in 1. He asked me to hold the watch. I know what comes next because the record shows it, and the record is what survives. Martinez was medevaced at 0541. He survived the night, survived the surgery, survived 2 subsequent surgeries, and is currently, as of the date of this compilation, in a rehabilitation program in a city I'm not going to name in this document. He sent Reyes the G-Shock by mail 3 weeks after the operation. No note. Reyes keeps it in the left breast pocket of whatever he's wearing, folded next to the photograph. He told me this at the very end, when he was standing up, when the session was technically over, and I had stopped recording and was closing my notepad. He told me it the way you tell someone something that you've decided they should know without having decided why. I think I know why. I think he needed someone to have it on record. Not the after-action report record. The other kind. The kind where a person sat across from another person in a cold fluorescent office and wrote down. He keeps it in the left breast pocket. The kind that knows the difference between a data point and a man. I walked out of that building at noon. November. Cold coming, the kind that doesn't apologize. I stood on the steps for a minute and thought about Vasil sitting on a rock with frost on his shoulders, looking south at a firebase 14 kilometers away, and about the specific belief required to do that. To sit in the cold for 14 weeks on the faith that someone would eventually climb the hill. About what it means to bury something at the top of a ridge and wait. About the people who make the decision to push north. I thought about Martinez's watch. About the way Reyes had described carrying it in the pocket closest to the body, which is where you keep the things you cannot afford to lose but cannot afford to hold in your hands. The things that need to be close, but not visible, warm, but not displayed, present, but not performed. I stood on the steps in the November cold for longer than I needed to. Then I went back inside. I had more reports on my desk, more coordinates, more material. I sat down and I opened the next file and I looked at the first entry and I drew a spiral in the corner of my notepad, smaller and smaller, the center never quite arriving. And I told myself, the way I always tell myself, that this one would be easier to stay at a professional distance from.